Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, coming your way prior to week 4. It's a Friday, 11:45 Eastern time in the morning. Looking forward to the conversation, as I always do, with Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. Before we dive into it with Steve, of course, like, comment, and subscribe to the videos here, where we bring you the best discussion, debate, and analysis of college football. All right, Steve, how you doing today?
Doing well, Mark. Doing well.
Browns-Jets last night. That's one of those where people stop and think, okay, Vegas, they really do know what they're doing and have this nailed. Of course, it was a half a point on either side. Being the NFL fan that I am of the Cleveland Browns, but also the guy that said, okay, I've got to be proven wrong first. I actually did pick the Browns to win the game, but 3.5 points, as we have talked about many times, and you've explained to the audience, that they reached that threshold of over a field goal. So I just had to think, okay, the Jets plus the 3.5 is just the probabilities are just too heavy on that side. But they came within a half point.
Yeah, it came within a field goal. The over-under, too. It closed around 40-41. So both lines are very accurate. Last night, I actually did not see a lot of value in that game. I stayed off the game. It's the first Thursday night game I haven't used this year. So in a way, by not using it, I feel I handicapped it correctly. It's funny how that works. But the key to that game was obviously Baker Mayfield, and it'll be interesting to see if he can spark that franchise. Only the second time they've won in the past 2.5 seasons in the NFL. I thought it was a good spot for Cleveland. You know, we talked about this last week. These home teams continue to do well in these Thursday night games, now 3-0 this season, including the Bengals winning outright as a dog, the Falcons winning as a pick-em. I'm sorry, the Eagles winning as a pick-em. So it's really tough for these road teams on these short, 3-day rest periods to travel and having to play again. So we'll see if Cleveland's able to carry that magic over into some real games coming up.
Steve Merrill joining us from Pro Sports Info. It's prosportsinfo.com. Just join him right there for his insight, not just into college football, the NFL, and all the major sports. We're lined up with 3 games tonight, 2 in the Power 5, as we head out to the West Coast with Washington State, Southern Cal. The game I'd like to ask you about in particular, also Penn State, Illinois, Florida Atlantic, Central Florida. That a bit of an interesting situation there because of the teams involved, the coaches and the personalities and so forth. USC, they've been road tested and haven't passed those tests. They only score a field goal at Stanford. They get blown away with 34 consecutive points in Austin against the Longhorns. So we at least have a foothold on USC's performance or lack thereof to date. Washington State, basically an unknown at this point.
Yeah, USC's been a play against team for me the last 2 weeks. I've had best bets both weeks going against them, best bet winners for my clients. Had Stanford 2 weeks ago, had Texas, as you mentioned, last week. A little slow start there by the Longhorns. They finally turned it on. So, yeah, USC's been a play against team. I've gone 2-0 the last 2 weeks going against them. I'm not sure I'm ready to pull the trigger with them this week either. I thought that offense would really struggle early in the season, and that's exactly what's happened. After that UNLV win, they've put up only 17 total points the last 2 games. Not sure they can just flip a switch and all of a sudden fix things. I do think there's some talent here, and I do think at some point this season, USC could become a play-on team for that reason. But right now, I would definitely have to see something on the field before backing them with real money.
I heard earlier this week that Georgia Tech has never, I want to get this straight, has never lost under Paul Johnson a game against the spread in which they were an underdog by at least something in the range of 15 or 16 points. And that, of course, being the case here this week, the line's holding pretty steady at 15.5 to 16 points. And these are a couple teams that play against each other. Ironically, Clemson has geared up for the triple attack option offense of Georgia Tech by playing some lesser teams that play the same style of offense. So we get Clemson and Georgia Tech. And really, I'll let you take off, Steve, on any games that intrigue you in terms of just the line maybe not being where you would expect or it moving throughout the week.
Well, actually, I think this Clemson game is an interesting one to talk about because Georgia Tech historically performs much better when their opponent does not have a bye week because it is difficult to get ready for that triple option. But as you mentioned, it's a really unique scheduling spot for Clemson because they just played Georgia Southern last week. And Clemson also plays Georgia Tech every year now, so they're becoming more and more familiar with it. Georgia Tech does not look like a good team this year. Road favorite at Pittsburgh last week. They lose that game outright. Clemson giving up only 2 yards per carry this season. So the fact that they're used to the option, they just faced it last week. Looks like an interesting setup here. Now, that's a really interesting angle you mentioned about, Johnson in the big spread, because it makes a lot of sense. Because first of all, when you run the ball, it keeps the score close. Normally, it runs the clock. One of the best point spread plays in all of college football for the past 2-3 decades has been Navy as an underdog. As a road dog, they've been over 60% for several decades now. So that angle works with these option teams. I just think this week could be a little bit different, as the setup is actually pretty good for Clemson.
Looking across the board, we're kind of getting away from those huge games of 35 and 40 and 45-point spreads as teams dive into their first and, in some instances, second conference games. So you see a lot of Virginia, Louisville, Florida, Tennessee, Stanford, Oregon. I'm just looking down the board. Kentucky, Mississippi State, obviously first conference games for most of those teams, and you see the spreads within a touchdown. I'm a bit surprised, even though Louisville has struggled, that they're a 5-point underdog at Virginia. That seems a bit heavy with the Cavaliers not proving anything as well.
Yeah, exactly. It reminds you of the Cleveland game last night, right? Obviously, the Browns are a little bit better than the Jets, but you just don't feel like they're primetime players where they're ready to lay that kind of a number. And you feel the same thing here. This just doesn't look right to see Virginia as more than a field goal favorite against really anybody in the conference, especially a team like Louisville that's been a powerhouse in recent years. Louisville's blowout loss to Alabama is not looking as bad now because Bama's done it to everybody and then some. In fact, they beat the other two teams, including Ole Miss, by even more. So we'll see if the Cavaliers are really stepping up their game. I think they're still suspect at quarterback. I think he looks to run more than he throws. And, this is an interesting line. This is definitely one that I think probably will jump off the board at a lot of people, and they'll have to take a second look at it.
Steve, in the past, we've talked about trap games, of course. We've also talked about having to get up for a big opponent 2 consecutive weeks and what that emotion does to you on that second turnaround, whether you came off a big win and the emotional high or the big letdown of a loss. And we've got that game in a very crucial game in the Big 12 with TCU going to Texas. The odds makers obviously still like the performance that they saw on the field from TCU in their first big test, even though the game was very close to the point spread with TCU falling to Ohio State by 12 points. They performed rather well, weren't out of the game until about 8 to 10 minutes left in the game, something in that range where the Buckeyes took over, and the game kind of went as expected. Texas maybe outperformed itself, or we'll have to see about USC down the line. But for TCU to go on the road following a loss and still be a favorite on the road at a place like Texas, where Texas is coming off a big win. Your thoughts about that game?
Yeah, I think this is a textbook example of a bad spot for TCU. Not only were they a double-digit home dog last week, and they have a really, a somewhat of a close game there for the most part, now they have to be a road favorite. And it's not like they're laying against a much weaker team. I actually think Texas might be the better team still. And I think maybe that was the buy sign for Texas. I, of course, had them as a best bet last week, but it wasn't looking too good early. They were trailing in the first half, but as you mentioned, Mark, they really turned it on after that. You almost feel like that momentum will carry in here, where TCU could have that hangover after a tough loss. It's very hard to have your A game every week, especially when you're talking about 19, 20-year-old kids in college football. And the fact also that TCU has won easily the last 2 years against Texas makes it more likely they could overlook this game even off the loss, whereas I think Texas will be ready to play. I like the fact they're remaining at home. This looks like a pretty good setup for the home dog.
Wisconsin has been such a consistent program, not quite in the elite of college football, but maybe a lot of people thought that this was possibly the year to take that next step and make a college football playoff appearance, but consistently a top 5 to 15 team in the country. Obviously, they take the stumble last week against BYU, the first time in forever, I think 2003, that Wisconsin's lost a non-conference game at home. They haven't played the toughest opponents during that span, but they lose to BYU. People trying to find out if Wisconsin is an aberration in regards to their performance last week, or they're just going to be a mundane Wisconsin team. And then they take to the road in a very difficult place to play against a team that they haven't played a killer schedule, but they did get tested against Iowa State in regards to a matchup and performed well on defense. Wisconsin, Iowa, the one team that appeared before the season started, Steve, to be able to challenge Wisconsin, now gets them in a vulnerable spot.
Yeah, I mean, Wisconsin's not looked good this year, and the 0-3 spread record is really indicative of the fact they've underperformed because the point spread is the great barometer if you're over or underperforming. I actually had a best bet back in week 1 against Western Kentucky. They win the game 34-3, but they still don't cover as a 35-point favorite. So they're 0-3 against the number now. Bad loss against BYU last week is more than a 3-touchdown home favorite. And you just kind of feel like Wisconsin's that type of team that just kind of, goes through the season, gets it done, but they're not a blowout Alabama, explosive type team anymore. And I think that might be the case in this game as well. They have had Iowa's number the past 2 seasons rather easily, but the Hawkeyes' rush defense has been fantastic. They're giving up less than 2 yards per carry overall. And I think that's definitely enough to keep this game close if Wisconsin isn't focused. The big X factor, the big question mark for me in this game is how does Wisconsin rebound from that loss? It's a serious blow to their national title hopes. But the fact is, it was a non-conference game, as you mentioned. So if they run the slate still in the Big Ten, they control their own destiny and probably still could find their way into the title game, especially if they beat a team like Ohio State in the conference championship game.
Not overreacting to the Vandy performance in which they had the ball thrown down to the 10-yard line to possibly give them a shot to beat Notre Dame last week in the closing seconds, 22-17. They go to South Bend, perform extremely well. They come home, and what does Vandy do with maybe that perceived prosperity of level of play, even though the moral victory you can maybe classify depending on your stance on that. They come home for South Carolina in a key SEC Eastern Division game early here, and South Carolina, their one big game, obviously, they're all amped up to prove that they can hang with Georgia, and they get blown out in that one, and they're a slight, roughly 2.5-point favorite against Vandy in Nashville.
Yeah, the bye week came at a really good time, I think, for South Carolina. Most of these teams don't want to have their bye in week 3 or a week off, rather. I mean, it wasn't planned necessarily, but I do think it could serve them really well here. Even with the distractions of the hurricane this past week, I think that time to rebound from the Georgia loss was a good thing. Had they played Vanderbilt the very next week, this could have been a bad letdown spot still. I would expect them to come in focused. I think when you have a hurricane like that too, it kind of refocuses you, makes you think about other things. So this looks like a good spot for South Carolina to get out of town, have a nice road win. And there's no question this line's at least a touchdown less than it would have been just a month ago. And for good reason. Vanderbilt's looked solid. They surprised me in week 1. They were only a 3-point favorite, beat Middle Tennessee 35-7, easily beat Nevada after that as a 10-point favorite, won by 31. And then, of course, last week, as you mentioned, Mark, 13-point dog. They only lose by 5 at Notre Dame, a game which they were competitive in. Their defense has been for real. They're giving up only 4 yards per play, only 13 points a game. If South Carolina comes focused here, and I do think that's a bit of a question mark with all the recent distractions, but if they come focused, I think we're going to say maybe at the end of the season, this line should have been a lot higher.
And then Notre Dame coming off of that same game against Vandy, where they look like one of the best teams in the country week 1 against Michigan, outperforming, maybe even a 7-point win. They look sloppy the next 2 weeks, and they go to Wake Forest. And then that for people that are looking for the big upset, that appears to be the one in play with Notre Dame having issues throwing the ball downfield.
Yeah, it's funny. I've done several shows today, and all of them, this has been the upset pick by the host. So caution alert.
Not this time.
I know. So we'll see. It'll be very interesting one because the line does look big to me also. I mean, it's tough to justify laying 7 on the road with Notre Dame when they only won by 5 at home against Vandy last week. They also didn't look very good in the week before that. Could maybe they've been hung over 2 games in a row after the big Michigan win. I did have a best bet on Notre Dame against Michigan, so I do still believe in this Notre Dame squad. But yeah, this looks like a public underdog upset pick, and history indicates anything. Those usually don't work out as well as you think.
Steve Merrill joins us from Pro Sports Info. You can join him right there, prosportsinfo.com. He covers all the sports and does an amazing job coming on here, getting us straight for each and every week of college football as we head toward week 4. A couple more games here, Steve. As we head out west, Arizona State, Washington, our perception of Arizona State changed dramatically with the week 1 blowout and then the Michigan State performance, obviously at home. Washington, though, the odds makers in Vegas obviously just consider them to be the premier team in the Pac-12. 18 points at home against an Arizona State team that's played pretty well, even though they lost last week against San Diego State. They came back in the fourth quarter, and it was a toss-up at the end.
Yeah, and I think last week was a kind of an overreaction based on the first 2 weeks. The odds makers made a pretty drastic adjustment. They make them a 5.5 point road favorite, then they lose outright. By the way, the two big home wins, including a home dog upset and then your road favorite, looks a lot like that TCU setup. The difference is, of course, TCU coming off a loss, but that was a typical what I call role reversal play. You had Arizona State winning outright as a home dog and then having to lay points on the road the next week. So definitely kind of excuse that loss last week. I don't read too much into it. The question is, can they play at home or play on the road here like they did in week 2 at home against Michigan State when they pulled the upset win? Washington, a solid 21-7 win against Utah last week. I thought Utah would be more competitive in that game, so I do consider that a solid victory. Still, I think the Pac-12 is down this year. Does look like Washington's the team to beat. It's just Arizona State's a tough team to handicap right now. They get that rah-rah factor with Herm Edwards. He's such a player's coach. I think a lot of that energy was used up in weeks 1 and 2, and that's another reason why they came out flat in week 3 last week at San Diego State. The question is, can he rally them now for another road game? Can he get them back to that level they had a few weeks ago?
Then finally, Steve, I asked the question, is there a point spread big enough for Alabama? They seem to get into one of these grooves every few years in which they just annihilate 3 or 4 consecutive opponents, and they just outplay the point spread. And we're talking about 2, I don't want to call them quality opponents, but Ole Miss and Louisville aren't going to be running around this year losing games by 55 and 60 points. It's just ridiculous what they're doing right now. And I know people are going to use the barometer of the Clemson game, but I'm just thinking Texas A&M playing at home where they just have a rabid fan base. They were up for that game, ready for that game, and played out of their minds, especially Kellen Mond. I don't necessarily know that they can throw the juice on in Tuscaloosa to take on Alabama. With that point spread, obviously the public knowing that Alabama is that dominant, it's risen throughout the week.
Yeah, and there's no question we're not going to get value anymore with Alabama because both the odds makers and the public know how good they are. But the thing is, they might not be able to help it to continue to cover. We talk about this every week. When your second team is better than everyone else's first team in some situations, the quarterback situation is also solid when you got 2 great quarterbacks. It's hard not to keep putting the points up, and that's what they've done so far. They've put up 51 points or more in each of their 3 games this season. And, maybe it's a letdown spot here or there, but the fact that they only beat A&M by 8 points on the road last year as a 25-point favorite makes you think they won't overlook this game. And then on top of that, they got Louisiana Lafayette on deck next week, so there's no look ahead. So really hard to go against them once again this week, as they should come in here focused. And if it's a focused team, I'm not sure anybody wants to play against them.
All right, so we've got a number of people in the chat serving up a number of comments and questions. A TCU fan in particular, not real happy with the comments, but that's typical. You're a fan of a team, you get some negative comments. You don't like the.
I don't make the scheduling situation.
Absolutely. So we do have somebody asking about the Oklahoma Army spread at around 31 points.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, and I almost brought it up earlier when we were talking about the Clemson game because I mentioned how Navy has been such a good road underdog for decades now as a point spread play. Army, you could put in that category now, too, because they're actually competitive now like Navy's been. Army's just never been competitive during those runs, so you really can't even look at their numbers. Isn't it ironic, though, you talk about spreads that jump out at you this week. That's why I meant to mention this earlier, is that this spread's basically where the UCLA spread was a few weeks ago at Oklahoma. So who would have ever thought Oklahoma would be laying the same amount of points against UCLA and Army within a couple weeks? Army, if they keep that clock moving and control the ball, they could stay within this big number, especially if Oklahoma overlooks them. The question, though, becomes if they get behind, which they obviously will, can they do enough to keep it close? Because when you don't throw the ball at all, it's really tough when you get down by 2 or 3 touchdowns. But Army normally keeps running the ball regardless, and this does look like a bit of a flat spot for Oklahoma, but just thought it was really ironic that the point spread's basically the same as it was against UCLA just a few weeks ago.
And we've got somebody on the line here who's liking Texas A&M to win straight out. Ray 7337. I would love to see it just to mix things up and give us something interesting to talk about with Bama losing at home, but I just don't see it. So what I found interesting the first 3 weeks of the season, Steve, at least for myself, who picks all the top 25 games, and then I venture outside the top 25 if there are games of note, relevant games that where the 2 teams just happen to be just outside the top 25. And I'm noticing a couple trends, one being that about 20% of the games are upsets. So out of the first 2 weeks, and I forget the exact numbers from week 3, I picked 19 games, and 5 of those, the clear underdog. Now, sometimes it was only a field goal, but clearly determined by Vegas to be an underdog. They won the game straight up because I think it's human nature to be conservative and just say the favorite's going to win, the favorite's going to win. But there is a technique just in saying I got to play the odds each week. If I'm going to predict all the games and I'm going to find upsets, there are going to be 20% upsets in the typical week. So I better go out there and find them.
Yeah, no question. Historically, with football, I know in the NFL, it's harder to run the numbers in college because there's not the odds aren't quite as accurate. So you're going to get more of the underdogs winning outright. You know, a 7-point underdog in college football winning outright is more likely than a 7-point underdog in the NFL because the odds aren't as accurate. With that said, though, historically speaking, you're better probably to play every underdog on the money line. Now, it's very difficult to do that unless you're taking a true long-term investment approach because you always have those games in which the team covers but doesn't win. But if you're willing to stomach that, your ROI, your return on investment is probably going to be better in the long term just playing the money line to win straight up. And I know in the NFL, when you're talking about underdogs of less than a touchdown, they win about 80% of the time straight up when they cover. So basically, the point spread normally does not matter 4 out of 5 times with touchdown or less underdogs in the NFL. It's a little less in college, but the same idea holds up. And most of the time, if you're playing a small dog in college football or the NFL, you better hope they can win the game outright because that's normally what has to happen.
As you well know, Steve, the Big Ten got hit with 4 upsets, and not just 4 upsets last week, 4 double-digit non-Power 5 teams beat Big Ten teams that were double-digit underdogs by, of course, in the BYU circumstance, 22-point underdog. Temple beat Maryland, 15-point dog. Akron over Northwestern as like a 3-touchdown underdog, and I'm missing the 4th one. Don't remember which game that was out there. There was another game out there, but Nebraska and Troy as like an 11-point underdog. Troy wins in Lincoln. So rough week for the Big Ten. And but again, those upsets are out there. You just have to find them.
Yeah, and that Nebraska game is hard to even feel like it was an upset because there's so much uncertainty right now with how that team's going to perform with Scott Frost. I didn't have anything in the game. I've stayed away from Nebraska with that uncertainty so far, but I was glad to see the upset. Because when I get that buy sign with Nebraska, and it might not happen, but here's the thing. If they play bad all season long, we just sit on the sidelines and wait. But what I'm hoping happens is after maybe week 6 or 7, they start to turn things around there because I really believe in Scott Frost. I believe he can really turn that team around like he did Central Florida. But you have to wait to see it happen on the field. And I'll give you another example of that is Florida State. I thought that was a spot last week in which they should have won by more than 3. Not only did they lose, but they're getting blown out basically in that game against Syracuse. Really hard to back FSU right now until we see them turn it around on the field first.
All right, Steve Merrill, Pro Sports Info. I always take a lot from these conversations each and every Friday as he gets us set with the betting lines for this weekend. Of course, we've got a nice little Friday night with the 2 Florida teams playing, Penn State, Illinois, and Washington State and USC. Thanks so much, Steve, for stopping by.
Thanks, Mark. Enjoyed it.
All right, everyone. I will stick around for a few minutes if you'd like to make some phone calls here to 860-325-3687. And again, join Steve at prosportsinfo.com where he covers all the major sports. And you're going to have to, excuse me, I'm going to have to leave the set for a second to go get my phone. If you guys would like to make some comments on the line and make a phone call in, otherwise we'll shut things down here in just a few minutes after I address the live chat. All right. All right. 860-325-3687. I will put that in the live chat and see what you guys are talking about. I know Zoom Play's not real happy right now, so we'll have to address that. Zoom Play. Steve has nothing against TCU. He's analyzing football games. He's crunching numbers. He's following stats and trends. That's it. If you caught my pick earlier in the week, despite what Steve had to say, and he knows a whole lot more than I know about tracking point spreads and picking these games. I like TCU. I just think they're a little bit more consistent in regards to running the ball. The more seasoned coach, I just think they're a more consistent football team. And I'm just based on one performance against a big-time team that Sean Robinson is a better quarterback right now than Sam Ehlinger. Again, Ehlinger played a full season or close to it, about 2/3 to 3/4 of a season last year for Texas. And he took on a couple of capable teams this season and really showed out against USC, although the team really, it wasn't like a quarterback carrying his team to victory. He had a lot of momentum, defense, special teams plays, and wide receiver plays from his group. But he played well in the second half. Still didn't complete 50% of his passes against USC. So I like the quarterback that I think is a better playmaker, the running game that's more stable, and the coach that has been there and done it time and time and time again. Although Texas has to get up after a big, high, emotional high in which there could be a letdown, but they've got the home crowd to back them up, where TCU has to come back from a game in which they played extremely well for about 50 to 52 minutes of time in the game and let down in the last 6 to 10 minutes, and they have to get up off the mat. And that shouldn't be difficult. Logically, that should not be difficult because they're now playing Texas, and they're playing in the Big 12, and they're playing for a Big 12 championship and a spot in the title game. So that shouldn't be difficult for TCU to do, but getting the emotions to fall in with logic doesn't always happen. So they've got to go on the road for a difficult setting in Austin. 2 or 3 sure picks. So as you guys will know, you to my picks. Great first week, lousy second week, amazing third week, hitting 16 out of 22 against the spread at 73%. I will probably retire on that if I could do that every week. So right now I'm a nice little 34 and 24 against the spread, despite a horrible, maybe worst ever week 2. I have yet to make my picks. Who's asking for my picks? Ray 7337. Ray, I will get those picks out to you very, very soon here in the next few hours. I haven't looked at the games, have yet to make my picks, and I actually don't like to have Steve on before I make my picks. Not that he's on here making predictions, but that forces me to look at the lines of the games. And what I typically like to do, I feel as though I'm not swayed by the line and I'm not swayed by Vegas, and I can make a clear conscious decision of the games if I just look at the games and the matchups, and then I write down my score, and then I go look at the line and see, okay, I liked Texas, and they were I think Texas is going to win by 3 touchdowns. I'm just using an example. Texas is going to win by 3 touchdowns, and they're only a 10-point favorite. So clearly, I really like Texas in this game. Unfortunately, the times that I do that, I look at the lines from Vegas after I've predicted the scores, and about half of them are within a point or two. So that's not a good thing. So again, 860-325-3687. I will not be around tonight to analyze any of the football games. I mentioned that earlier this week. So we do have Penn State, Illinois, Washington State, USC, and Florida Atlantic and UCF. For as much as I would love to watch those 3 games, what would happen is I throw them on DVR, and then I'll never watch them because Saturday's Saturday, and there's way too much football to try to keep track of on Saturday. So I'll be back here to recap the 3:30 games on Saturday, also the primetime games and the late night games in college football. And why don't we, before we shut things down, again, I'll remind you, 860-325-3687, that I'm going to run through the day in college football tomorrow and how I would approach the viewing day. Now, every time I do this, I basically let you know what my plan is. Now, my plan tomorrow is I'm not going to be home until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'm going to miss the first half of the 3:30 games. I'm going to miss the noon games, and I'm going to have to catch back up with those and probably watch a lot of fourth quarters of games from noon in particular. But there is a group of really good games 4 in particular at noon tomorrow. Georgia at Missouri, Notre Dame at Wake Forest, Nebraska at Michigan, BC at Purdue. I would love to see all those games, but I would prioritize Nebraska, Michigan, just because it's a brand name game and a traditional matchup. And let's see if Nebraska can bounce it back and pull off a slight miracle, if there is such a thing. I think that's an oxymoron, a slight miracle. If it's a miracle, it couldn't be slight. You know what I mean? Nebraska at Michigan. Michigan's not a great team. They haven't been thus far, but they're really good and obviously one of the best defenses in the country. So that would be my number one choice. Nebraska, Michigan, and then the Notre Dame Wake Forest situation intrigues me. Georgia could blow out Mizzou, but to see Drew Lock against that defense is special. BC, Purdue, sure, the Boilers are 0-3, but of course they've lost these 3 games in the most excruciating manner for the most part. Last play of the game on basically all 3. So that's going to be a difficult one for BC on the road at Purdue, coming off the big win that they had at Wake Forest by a touchdown. So that's what I'm looking at noon is Nebraska, Michigan, and then I'm keeping my other screens and laptops on the other games. All right, at 3:30, we're lined up with, there's usually one matchup that's enormous, not necessarily this week. You've got Alabama, Texas A&M would be my first choice just because it's the number 1 team in the country, and Texas A&M played so well at home against Clemson. Can they do it again? Can they put up that kind of fight against one of the elites? And at this point, it appears to be the best team in the country. Clemson, Georgia Tech, I don't expect to be a great game, but I'd obviously have my eye on that one. And then the other one, Kansas State and West Virginia. Maybe K-State hangs in there against Will Grier and company. So not a lot of great games at 3:30. Northern Illinois, the way Florida State's playing, could put up a fight. That could be the possibility of me seeing, oh, Florida State, Northern Illinois, 17 all, 4 minutes left. I'm switching to ESPNU to check out the last 4 minutes of that game to see what happens. Then as we take it through the night, if you've got the SEC network, South Carolina Vandy could be a nice game. Okay, then we start at 4:30, and depending what's going on with Alabama, Texas A&M, if that's already 28-3, then I am going immediately to Texas and TCU at 4:30. Now, if Bama and A&M are 17-14, close to halftime, then I hang with that and I put my secondary radar on Texas TCU. But most likely, I'm going to Texas and TCU right at 4:30. And that's probably going to be the game as I walk in the door at roughly 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday is going to be my game. Mississippi State and Kentucky, ESPN2 at 7 o'clock. Could be a decent game. I could also see the Bulldogs winning big in that one. Oklahoma State maybe gets tested by Texas Tech. That's a 7 o'clock game on Fox on FS1. As we get into the primetime games, I know which one I'm going to love to see. And then at 7 o'clock, so at 7 o'clock, depending on what's going on with Texas TCU, most likely I am really locked into Texas and TCU at 7 o'clock. It's a good game. It's in Austin. It's close. That's my game. And then I put on the radar Florida, Tennessee at 7, Kentucky, Mississippi State at 7. Those are the 2 7 o'clock games that I'm watching in the background. But if for whatever reason TCU and Texas turns into blowout, then I'm going to Florida and Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi State. Which way do you go? Well, Florida, Tennessee is the more marquee matchup in terms of name brand and history, but Mississippi State, Kentucky might be a little bit more important right now. And so 7 o'clock, I'm looking at those 2 games. 7:30, Michigan State, Indiana. So you got very comparable games. But then, bam, 8 o'clock, which means about an 8:15 kickoff, Stanford, Oregon. So I see about a quarter of those 3 matchups that I mentioned in the SEC. And then I go directly to Oregon, Stanford. That's got my attention at 8:15. And then at 8:30, I've got a real decision to make because I love the matchup with Wisconsin and Iowa, and that carries me through the night. I am juggling Stanford, Oregon, and Wisconsin, Iowa. And then late night, do we have anything to watch? Well, we do. At 10:30, Arizona State, can they pull off the upset at Washington and bounce back? I've got to watch the Pac-12 there. with only one game, major game. Really only one game in the Pac-12 late night. There's usually 2 or 3 to juggle, but this week it's just Washington hosting Arizona State. So once again, the number is 860-325-3687. Zoom play, I hope we put you in a good place. TCU not being picked on by Steve. He's running numbers, trends, stats. He just doesn't like TCU in this spot this week. I do. I'm going to disagree with Steve. That's probably a death sentence for me, but I like TCU by 3 points, which puts me right on the line. I don't know what I'm going to pick against the spread, but I'm definitely taking TCU to win in Austin against Texas 27-24. So West End 04. I've done that before, haven't I? West End 04, when I don't have my contacts in. West End 04 is looking for the Princeton helmet. The Princeton helmet, it could be placed back there if I get enough votes for Princeton. So if you've missed my little contest of sorts, unfortunately, you get nothing as the winner except the joy of seeing whatever helmets you select back there on the board. So currently we've got the 4 teams from the playoff in 2016, Alabama, Washington, Clemson, and Ohio State. Then I picked up Tennessee and Ole Miss, and I've explained why. So we've got 6 helmets. Somebody mentioned the other night in the live chat, Mark, you need more helmets. You need new helmets. You're stuck on the same 6. And I said, absolutely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to track your comments, and don't leave them in the live chat. Do not leave your helmet choices in the live chat because I won't see them, because to go back after this post and try to carve through the live chat, because I can't see all the comments at once, I would have to go to the end of the live chat and the live stream and see the live chat and go through the entire thing. No. So go to any video, go to this video, go to the helmets video I produced, go to any video and leave your selection of the 2 helmets that you want to see back here. And keep in mind the 6 I already have, so you don't need to vote for any of those 6. The 2 helmets that you want to see. I don't care, group of 5, UMass, whoever. There you go. 2 helmets, and whichever 2 teams receive the most votes by October 1st, I'm going to tally on October 1st. Whichever 2 receive the most votes, they get purchased, and I'm going to throw them up there. Those 2 for sure, because I could possibly buy some other ones. And because if I'm making an order, I might as well make an order. We'll see. But I'm buying 2 for sure, and they're going to be the 2 that you have voted the most. So I've received a bunch of votes, probably not a ton, 20 or 30 maybe, probably more than that. So we're going to add 2 helmets. So if you want particular helmets, do not mention these in the live chat. Go to any of the videos and select your helmets by leaving those choices in the live chat. Not in the live chat, in the comments. Jamie, you can counter the U-Dump helmet by voting for Oregon. No, sorry. They're pretty prominent, especially in the Pac-12. I did have somebody on the line the other night, one of the callers, I think it was Bash Gaming, talking about Washington always dominating the Pac-12. And I didn't challenge him on that because he was talking about something else and I didn't want to interrupt. But I wanted to correct him to say, when has Washington dominated the Pac-12? We have to go back to the early 1990s. They won 1 Pac-12 championship. That was 2 years ago. Before that, they weren't a factor. They won the Pac-12 championship in 2016. They didn't win the Pac-12 championship last year. They didn't even get to the championship game last year. So believe Bash Gaming was making the comment. I know that he was making the comment. I wasn't really following his line of thinking that he was saying Washington always dominates the Pac-12. one championship in 25 years is not dominance. Jamie on the line, obviously gearing up for Oregon and Stanford. I should deliver a preview on that game. I took notes. I should probably deliver a preview and prediction on that game. So my thoughts as my day is shrinking. I've just got a few hours today. That what I will do is I will knock out a preview and prediction on Texas A&M, Alabama, and also Stanford, Oregon at the very least. I would like to get to Wisconsin, Iowa. I've got to make my predictions as well. Get those to you. Remember, 16-6 against the spread last week, and I'm going to say that about 18 more times before I can't say it anymore because my week 4 is not going to be 16-6 most likely. But that's the deal. The newsletter. If anybody's on the live chat right now, or if you're watching postmortem and you see it posted on YouTube, obviously for those of you that are watching on the live chat and you missed a ton of the conversation with Steve Merrill, Pro Sports Info, then all you have to do is wait for this video to process and post. You go back and you watch what you missed. All right. Like, comment, subscribe. I can't emphasize that enough. The likes drive this. Our guy George gets on from time to time and has that conversation with me and tries to push and encourage everybody to like the videos, comment, and subscribe because that will help me to continue to do this and to do it in a much better fashion, to devote more time, and to give it the play that I need. This is what I would like to do all the time. This is the goal, to do this, and we would do far better things with a far better set and more people contributing, and we would provide more interesting content, and we would provide more diversity of content in regards to more games and more contributions, and the whole thing would just be so much better. So the way that you can also contribute is not to do anything or spend any more money than you normally would. But if you shop on Amazon, or if your significant other shops on Amazon, just have them use the link that I provide in all the videos. So if you go to any of my videos and you see the Amazon link that's provided in the description section under the video, the Amazon links, just enter Amazon using one of those links. You don't need to purchase the crazy college football stuff that I put on there. Just simply enter using that link. And I'm distracted by this comment. Seems to be somewhat interesting. I lost it. Anyway, use the Amazon links to enter Amazon, do your regular shopping, purchase whatever you would have normally. Just use the links to enter Amazon, and that drives the channel as well. We want to do this full time. We want to do it to the best of our ability. We want to provide you with the best college football content imaginable. By many respects and many measurements, it's about as good as it gets right now, with debate and discussion, analysis from myself and the best bloggers, broadcasters in the country all the time. All right. The conversation in the chat, just always good. Always good. Blasting Bama's schedule. And the SEC equals yawn. Ray, who's your team? If you're joining the chat at any time for a first time, I always would like to know what team you root for and how long you've been watching, because sometimes I discover that people have been watching for a year. They just haven't ever decided to jump in. Ray's a big Mercer fan. Awesome. So I'm sorry. I apologize for the lack of Mercer coverage. I don't know what heavyweights they're playing this year, but of course, in the last few years, it's been a shot at Auburn, a shot at Alabama, and things haven't worked out too well for Mercer. But at least they play them. All right. Mercer. All right. Jamie, Dennis, Navy Thomas, Bama Boy, Ray, Zoom Play. We love you. TCU is going to be all right. They're going to be fine. They've got a clean slate in the Big 12, and regardless of what criticism or lack of respect that they receive, hey, Gary Patterson will get it done. All right. We appreciate it. I will be back here late on Saturday, most likely right before the primetime games, around 7:30, 8 o'clock to wrap up the 3:30 and the noon action, looking toward the primetime games of Stanford, Oregon. We also have Wisconsin, Iowa as a huge one in the Big Ten Western Division, and then late night right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. And you will see my previews and predictions later today, and also my Week 4 picks right here. We will see you next time.